Chapter 1. The Dashwoods. The Dashwood family had lived in Sussex for a long time. They had a large house with gardens and were well thought of by those who knew them. An old man owned the house and, when his sister died, he invited his nephew, Mr. Henry Dashwood, and his family to move in with him. He loved them all very much, and they were kind to him. Mr. Henry Dashwood had one son from his first marriage and 3 daughters from his second. His son was very rich because his mother gave him a lot of money, but his daughters were not. When the old man died, he left the beautiful house and gardens to Mr. Dashwood's son and his son's son, a child of 4 years. This left Mr. Dashwood with no way of caring for his daughters, who had been so kind to the old man for many years. He was so worried that he became sick and died 1 year after his uncle died, leaving only £10,000 to his wife and daughters. Before he died, he told his son to take care of his mother-in-law and his sisters. Mr. John Dashwood gave his promise to his father and decided to give them £1,000 each every year. However, he was a selfish man, and his wife was even more selfish than he was. As soon as the funeral was over, John Dashwood's wife arrived at the house with her child. It was true that the house now belonged to her, but she wanted her mother-in-law to move out. It was not a nice thing to do. Mrs. Dashwood was the most upset, having just lost her husband and hated her daughter-in-law for her actions. Eleanor, Mrs. Dashwood's eldest daughter, always gave good advice to her mother, even though she was only 19. She was a lovely girl with strong feelings, and she knew how to control them. It was a knowledge that her mother and one of her sisters had not learned. Mary Ann was very similar to her mother. She was sensible and clever, but could not control her emotions well. Eleanor was always worried by the excess of her sister's sensibility. Margaret, the third sister, was a nice girl, but at 13, she was still a child compared with her sisters. Mrs. John Dashwood soon moved into Norland and made her mother and sisters-in-law feel like visitors in their own home. She thought that the money her husband had planned to give to his sisters was far too much. It would mean that their little boy would become poor. How could he rob his own child by giving money to women who were only his half-sisters? One day, she asked him to rethink his decision. "It was the last thing my father asked of me," replied her husband. "He was sick. If he had been well, he would not have asked you to take money from your own child. Perhaps then, I could have the sum. £500 is still a lot of money." "Oh yes, what brother on earth would do so much for his sisters, not even his real sisters? You are a generous man." "I wouldn't do anything mean," he replied. "It will still be a very comfortable life for any young woman. I also think it might be good to do something for their mother while she lives, a gift of some money each year." His wife paused. "Yes," she said, "we could do that. But then, if Mrs. Dashwood lives for another 15 years, we will be poor." "Yes, perhaps you are right, my love. A present of £50, now and then, will be enough to keep my promise to my father." "Oh yes, I am sure it will. And I am sure that your father would have asked you for nothing more than that. Really, they will be able to give you something." In this way, Mr. John Dashwood decided that the best way to help his mother-in-law and sisters was to do exactly as his clever wife had said. Mrs. Dashwood stayed at Norland for several months after her husband died, not because she was happy there, but because she noticed a growing friendship between Eleanor, her eldest girl, and the brother of Mrs. John Dashwood. Edward Ferrars was the eldest son of a man who had died very rich, but it was enough for Mrs. Dashwood that he appeared to be a good man, that he loved her daughter, and that Eleanor loved him. Edward Ferrars was not handsome, but when his natural shyness disappeared, he was a friendly person. His mother and sister wanted him to become an important man with important friends, but they did not know exactly what. But Edward had no desire to enter politics or to be a great man, and instead liked to be at home. Mrs. Dashwood was sure that Eleanor and Edward would soon marry. "In a few months, my dear Mary Ann," she said to her daughter, "Eleanor will probably be married. We will miss her, but she will be happy." "Oh, Mama, what will we do without her?" "My love, we will live very close to each other and meet every day. You will have a new brother. But you don't look happy, Mary Ann. Do you think your sister is making a bad choice?" "Perhaps," said Mary Ann. "It is a little surprising. Edward is very nice, but he is missing something. He is not passionate. There is no fire in his eyes. And he has no real taste, Mama. He doesn't like music. And while he seems to like Eleanor's drawings, he does not understand them. The more I see of the world, Mama, the more I think I will never find a man I can truly love. Remember, my love, that you are not yet 17. It is far too early to decide such a thing. The next day, Marianne and Eleanor were talking. Isn't it a shame, Eleanor, that Edward cannot draw? Well, he may not draw, but he likes looking at other people's drawings. I think he would draw very well if he had the chance to learn. He has natural talent. I am sorry, Eleanor, if I do not say good things about Edward. I do not know him as well as you do, but I do think he is a very nice man. I think, replied Eleanor, that anyone who has had a conversation with him will tell you that he has an excellent understanding and character. Now, I feel I know him so well that I think him really handsome, or at least almost so. It is true that I think very highly of him, and that I like him. Marianne burst out. Like him? Cold-hearted Eleanor, don't tell me you like him. Use those words again and I will leave the room this moment. Eleanor could not help laughing. It is true that my feelings are stronger than my words, but I am not sure of Edward's feelings toward me. Also, there are other things to consider. His sister would surely be against him marrying a woman with no money. Marianne was surprised to find out how wrong she and her mother had been. So you really are not engaged to him, she said. Well, it will soon happen, and it will give him a chance to improve his drawing. Eleanor had told her sister the truth. While her feelings for Edward were strong, there was, at times, something missing in him. He was often sad, and she knew that his sister did not make it easy for him to feel comfortable at home. Whatever Edward's feelings might be, his sister's were clear. She took the first opportunity to tell her mother-in-law of Mrs. Ferrara's decision, that both her sons should marry well, and of the danger waiting for any young woman who tried to attract either of them. Mrs. Dashwood became very angry and decided that, whatever the inconvenience and expense of so sudden a removal, her beloved Eleanor should not be exposed to another week to such a rude daughter-in-law. The next day, Mrs. Dashwood received a letter containing a well-timed offer of a small house, Barton Cottage. It came from one of her relations, a rich gentleman in Devonshire. He told her that everything would be done to make her comfortable, even if the house was smaller than she was used to. The friendly letter cheered Mrs. Dashwood during the uncertain time of her decision to leave Norland. She instantly wrote her reply to Sir John Middleton, accepting his offer, and then rushed to show the letter of invitation and her acceptance letter to her daughters. Chapter 2. Barton Cottage. No sooner had she sent her reply to Sir John, Mrs. Dashwood announced to her son-in-law and his wife that she had found a house and would no longer need to stay with them. They were very surprised by her news. Mrs. Dashwood took the house for a year. It was already furnished, and she could move in immediately. She set about packing their things, selling her carriage, and preparing herself for a simpler life in Devonshire. Her son-in-law showed no sign of keeping his promise to his late father. Instead, he talked of money so often that it seemed he was more in need of it than intent on giving any away. In this way, in only a few weeks after the arrival of Sir John Middleton's first letter to Norland, everything was ready for Mrs. Dashwood and her daughters to begin their journey. There were tears from all as they said their last goodbyes to the home they loved so much. "Dear, dear Norland," said Marianne, as she walked alone in front of the house. "Will I ever stop missing you? Will anywhere else ever truly be home? You will continue the same without us, but who will remain to enjoy you?" They were all quiet for the first part of the trip, but became more cheerful when they approached the area where they were now to live. Barton Cottage, though small, was comfortable and compact. A narrow passage led directly through the house into the garden behind. It was not a very old house and was in good repair. In comparison to Norland, it was poor and small indeed, but their servants were pleased to see them, and they each decided to appear happy. It was very early in September and fine weather, and this gave them a good first impression of their new home. The house was in a good position. High hills rose immediately behind, and they were surrounded by fields. They could see the village of Barton on one of the hills. Mrs. Dashwood was quite satisfied with the size and furniture of the house and had enough money to add any other comforts. She decided that, next spring, if she had enough money, she would extend some of the rooms to accommodate the parties she planned to host for her many friends. Until spring, however, they would need to be happy with the house as it was. Each of them was busy arranging their things and, in doing so, trying to form themselves a home. Marianne's pianoforte was unpacked, and Eleanor's drawings were put on the walls of their sitting room. The next day, the landlord called to welcome them to Barton. Sir John Middleton was a good-looking man of about 40 years old. He was good-humored, and his manners were as friendly as they were in his letters. He seemed very happy to see them comfortable at Barton Cottage. His kindness was not limited to words. Within an hour after he left them, a large basket full of garden stuff and fruit arrived from the park, followed by a present of a chicken. He also insisted on sending them his newspaper every day. The next day, Lady Middleton came to call. She was not more than 26 or 7. She was elegant and beautiful. However, after being with her for a short time, they soon noticed that she was quiet, cold, and had little to say. Sir John kept the conversation going, and Lady Middleton had brought with her their eldest child, a fine little boy about 6 years old. He provided an effortless topic of conversation for the ladies. They asked his name and age, and other questions that his mother answered for him. It took up 10 minutes deciding whether the boy was more like his father or mother, and in what way. For of course everybody differed. The Dashwoods were soon given an opportunity to debate on the rest of the children, as Sir John would not leave the house without their promise of dining at the park the next day. Barton Park was about half a mile from the cottage. The house was large and handsome, and the Middletons nearly always had some friends staying with them in the house. Sir John was a sportsman, and Lady Middleton a mother. He hunted and she took care of her children. They had no other jobs. Lady Middleton loved to host fine parties, but Sir John liked to have young people around him. And the noisier they were, the better. In summer, they held many outdoor parties, and in winter, many private balls. Sir John was very happy with the arrival of a new family. The Miss Dashwoods were young, pretty, and charming. In showing kindness to his cousins, he felt happy to show his good heart, and in having a family of females in his cottage, he had all the happiness of a sportsman. Mrs. Dashwood and her daughters were met at the door of the house by Sir John, who welcomed them to Barton Park. He apologized at being unable to get any smart young men to meet them that day. They would see, he said, only one gentleman there besides himself, a friend who was neither very young nor very happy. He assured them it should never happen again. Luckily, Lady Middleton's mother had arrived at Barton within the last hour, and as she was a very cheerful woman, he hoped the young ladies would not be bored. The young ladies, as well as their mother, were perfectly satisfied. Mrs. Jennings, Lady Middleton's mother, was a funny, fat, elderly woman who talked a great deal and seemed very happy. She was full of jokes and laughter, always on the subject of lovers and husbands. She hoped they had not left their hearts behind them in Sussex, and liked to see them blush. Colonel Brandon, the friend of Sir John, was silent and serious. Lady Middleton asked Marianne to sing many songs, while Colonel Brandon just watched silently. Marianne felt a respect for him because of the pleasure he took in her music. Mrs. Jennings was a widow. She had only 2 daughters, both of whom were married, and she now had nothing to do but to marry all the rest of the world. Soon after her arrival at Barton, she decided that Colonel Brandon was very much in love with Marianne Dashwood. She guessed it to be so after the very first evening of their being together. It must be so. It would be an excellent match, for he was rich and she was beautiful. Mrs. Jennings had been anxious to see Colonel Brandon well married, and she always wanted to get a good husband for every pretty girl. "Oh, Mama," said Marianne one day, "Colonel Brandon is old enough to be my father, and far too old to fall in love. Didn't you hear him complain of the cold? It is surely a sign of his old age." "My dearest child," said her mother, laughing, "it must seem to you a miracle that my life has been extended to the advanced age of 40. Mamma, that is not what I meant. Of course, he may live another 20 years, but at 35, he is far too old to marry or to fall in love." Soon after this, Eleanor left the room. "Mamma," said Marianne, "I am sure Edward Ferrars is not well. We have now been here almost a fortnight, and yet he does not come. What else can keep him at Norland?" "Did he say he would come so soon?" asked Mrs. Dashwood. "He did not seem happy to accept my invitation when I asked him to visit us at Barton." "How strange their behavior is," replied Marianne. "How cold were their last goodbyes. How normal their conversation was the last evening they were together. Edward said goodbye to me in the same way he did to Eleanor. And Eleanor, in leaving Norland, and Edward, did not cry as I did. It is all very strange." Chapter 3. Meet Mr. Willoughby. The Dashwoods were now quite comfortable at Barton, and the house and garden were now familiar to them. They did not have many visitors, as Mrs. Dashwood did not wish to visit any of the families beyond the distance of a walk, and there were few of those. About 1.5 miles from the cottage, the girls had, in one of their earliest walks, discovered an ancient house that reminded them a little of Norland. However, they soon learned that its owner, an elderly lady of very good character, was unfortunately too sick to mix with the world and never left her home. The whole country about them was full of beautiful walks. After 2 days of rain, Marianne and Margaret set off to enjoy one of these together. They happily ran down the hills, searching for every piece of blue sky. Then, all of a sudden, the clouds came together over their heads, and a hard rain fell in their faces. Surprised, they had to turn back and began to run at full speed back to the house. At first, Marianne was ahead, but she slipped in the wet and was suddenly on the ground. Margaret, unable to stop herself, soon reached the bottom in safety. A young gentleman carrying a gun with 2 dogs playing around him saw Marianne fall. He put down his gun and ran to her assistance. She had twisted her ankle and could barely stand. He took her up in his arms and carried her down the hill. He walked through the garden and into the house and seated her on a chair. Eleanor and her mother stood up in amazement at their entrance. The man apologized for the interruption, in a manner that made him appear even more handsome than he already was. Mrs. Dashwood thanked him again and again and invited him to be seated. He declined, as he was dirty and wet. His name was Willoughby, and his present home was at Allenham. He asked if she might allow him to call tomorrow to ask about Miss Dashwood, and then set out again in the heavy rain. Sir John called on them that morning. They asked him if he knew any gentleman by the name of Willoughby at Allenham. "Willoughby!" cried Sir John. "What, is he in the country? That is good news. I will ask him to dinner on Thursday. He is as good a man as ever lived, and a fine rider." "But who is he?" asked Eleanor. "Where does he come from? Does he have a house at Allenham?" Sir John told them that Mr. Willoughby had no property of his own in the country, but was visiting the old lady at Allenham Court. Yes, he is very well worth catching, Miss Dashwood. He has property of his own in Somersetshire, and if I were you, I would not give him up to my younger sister, even though he helped her after she fell down." "I do not believe," said Mrs. Dashwood with a smile, "that my daughters are in the habit of catching men. They are very safe with us, however rich." Yes, I see how it will be," said Sir John. "I expect he will forget all about Colonel Brandon now. Poor old Brandon." Mr. Willoughby called at the cottage early the next morning, as he said he would. He was received by Mrs. Dashwood with kindness, following Sir John's information. Miss Marianne Dashwood had a lovely face and was often called a beautiful girl. Her smile was sweet and attractive. In her eyes, which were very dark, there was a life, a spirit, which was lovely to see. At first she was shy in front of Willoughby, but any embarrassment soon passed. When she heard him declare that he loved music and dancing above everything else, she liked him immediately. They found they had many other things in common. They shared the same taste in books and held similar opinions on music. "Well, Marianne," said Eleanor, as soon as he had left them, "for one morning I think you have done pretty well. You have discovered Mr. Willoughby's opinion in almost every matter of importance. What will you possibly have left to talk of next time you meet?" Willoughby seemed very happy to have met them. He came to them every day. At first he came to ask after Marianne, but soon became a friend of the family. He and Marianne read. They talked, and they sang together. He was a talented musician. He read with all the sensibility and spirit that Edward had not. In Mrs. Dashwood's opinion, he was as faultless as in Mary Ann's. Yet in Eleanor's opinion, he was a little too forward. Eleanor pitied poor Brandon, yet Willoughby and Mary Ann often laughed about him for being neither lively nor young. "Brandon is just the kind of man," said Willoughby one day, "whom everybody speaks well of and nobody cares about, and whom all are delighted to see and nobody remembers to talk to." "That is exactly what I think of him," cried Mary Ann. "That is not true," said Eleanor. "He is well liked by all at Barton Park, and I always enjoy talking to him. Why do you dislike him?" "He is a good man," said Willoughby, "who nobody notices, with more money than he can spend, more time than he knows what to do with, and 2 new coats every year." "Well," replied Eleanor, "I think he is a sensible man, intelligent, kind, and with a good heart." "Miss Dashwood," cried Willoughby, "do not think me unkind. I agree with you on some points, but I have my own reasons, and must be allowed to dislike him." Mrs. Dashwood and her daughters did not imagine that they would be so busy living at Barton Cottage. They had many invitations and visitors. There were private balls at the park, and there were many parties on the water in October. Willoughby was included in every meeting, and he and Mary Ann soon became very close. Eleanor was not surprised by their behavior. She only wished that they would not be so open. She tried to tell her sister, but she would not listen. When he was there, she had no eyes for anyone else. Everything he did was right, and everything he said was clever. This was the season of happiness to Mary Ann. Her heart belonged to Willoughby, and she found herself happy in her present home. Eleanor's happiness was not so great. She missed Norland very much. Neither Lady Middleton nor Mrs. Jennings provided her with interesting conversation. Willoughby was only interested in her sister. Only in Colonel Brandon did Eleanor find a person who she could respect, who excited the interest of friendship. From a conversation they had together while the others were dancing one evening, she had reason to believe that he had been disappointed in love before. As Eleanor and Mary Ann were talking together the next morning, Mary Ann told her sister some news. Willoughby had given her a horse, one that he had raised himself in Somersetshire. Eleanor expressed her concern at Mary Ann receiving so big a present from someone they had known for so short a time. She did not press the issue with Mary Ann, but instead approached their mother, who instructed Mary Ann to refuse the present at once. When Willoughby called at the cottage the same day, Eleanor heard her express her disappointment to him in a low voice on having to reject his present. Willoughby replied, "But Mary Ann, the horse is still yours. I shall keep it until you can take it. When you leave Barton to form your own home, you shall have it then." This was all overheard by Eleanor, and from that moment she was sure that they were engaged to each other. Then Margaret told her something the next day that made things even clearer. "Oh, Eleanor," she cried, "I have such a secret to tell you about Mary Ann. I am sure she will be married to Mr. Willoughby very soon." "You have said so," replied Eleanor, "almost every day since they first met. But this is quite another thing. I am sure they will be married very soon, for he has got a lock of her hair. I am almost sure it is hers, for I saw him cut it off last night. He kissed it and took it with him." A party was formed that evening to go the next day to see a very fine place about 12 miles from Barton belonging to a brother-in-law of Colonel Brandon. The gardens were said to be highly beautiful. They would sail on the lake, eat a cold lunch, and enjoy the day together. Mrs. Dashwood, who had a cold, was persuaded by Eleanor to stay at home. Chapter 4. Talk of an engagement. By 10 o'clock, everyone was at Barton Park, ready for their day trip to Whitwell. While they were at breakfast, the letters were brought in. Among them, there was one for Colonel Brandon. He took it, looked at the address, changed color, and immediately left the room. "What is the matter with Brandon?" asked Sir John. "I hope he has had no bad news," said Lady Middleton. In about 5 minutes, he returned. "No bad news, Colonel, I hope," said Mrs. Jennings as soon as he entered the room. "I am sorry, ma'am," he said to Lady Middleton, "but I must go to town for business immediately. I am sorrier because I need to be there for you all to enter Whitwell. How awful this was!" "But if you write a note, Mr. Brandon," said Mary Ann, "would that be enough?" He shook his head. Eleanor then heard Willoughby say in a low voice to Marianne, "He was afraid of catching a cold, I am sure. I think he wrote the letter himself." Colonel Brandon told him there was nothing he could do. He then said his goodbyes to the party. "Will you and your sisters be in town this winter, Miss Dashwood?" "No," replied Eleanor. "Then I will not see you for a long time." "I can guess what his business is," said Mrs. Jennings, after the colonel had left the room. "It is about Miss Williams, I am sure." "Who is Miss Williams?" asked Marianne. "She is a relation of the colonel's, my dear." Then, in a low voice, she added, "She is his daughter." When Sir John returned, he suggested that they might as well go for a drive around the country. Willoughby and Marianne went together. They were not seen again until they returned later. That evening, there were 20 people at dinner, and Willoughby sat between the two elder Miss Dashwoods. Mrs. Jennings sat to Eleanor's right and leaned over and said to Marianne, loud enough for them both to hear, "I know where you spent the morning." She told them she knew that they had gone to Allenham and spent a long time there walking about the garden and going all over the house. As soon as they finished dinner, Eleanor asked her sister about it. "Marianne, did you go to the house while Mrs. Smith was there, just yourself and Mr. Willoughby?" "Yes, that's right, and I never had a nicer morning in all my life." "But, my dear Marianne, it was not right for you to go there alone. What will people think?" "Well, the house and garden will one day be Mr. Willoughby's, and—" "If they were one day to be your own, Marianne, it would still not have been right." "Oh, Eleanor, but it is a lovely house, I can tell you." The next day, thoughts of Colonel Brandon's mysterious letter filled the mind of Mrs. Jennings. "Something terrible must have happened, I am sure," she said. "I could see it in his face. Well, I wish him out of trouble with all my heart, and wish that he finds a good wife too." Eleanor, however, was confused by her sister and Willoughby. Why had they not yet told her mother of their engagement? The cottage had become like a home to Willoughby, and he spent many more hours there than at Allenham. One evening, Mrs. Dashwood mentioned to him her plans for improving the cottage in the spring. "No," he replied, "not a stone must be changed." "Do not worry," said Miss Dashwood. "My mother will never have enough money to change anything." "I hope so," he cried. "May she always be poor, if that is what she plans to do. Mrs. Dashwood, how could you change this room in which we have spent so many happy hours together?" Mrs. Dashwood told him that no changes would be made. "You are a good woman," he warmly replied. "Your promise makes me happy. Please promise me one thing more, that you will always consider me with kindness." The promise was given, and Willoughby was very happy all evening. "Shall we see you tomorrow at dinner?" asked Mrs. Dashwood when he was leaving them. He agreed to be with them by 4 o'clock. Mrs. Dashwood's visit to Lady Middleton took place the next day, but Marianne remained at home. On their return from the park, they entered the house to see Marianne run upstairs to her room with her handkerchief to her eyes. Surprised and alarmed, they went directly into the room she had just left, where they found Willoughby. "Is anything the matter with her?" cried Mrs. Dashwood. "Is she ill?" "I hope not," he replied, trying to look cheerful. "I am afraid I have some bad news. Mrs. Smith told me this morning I must go to London on business. This is very unfortunate, but you will not be gone for long, I hope." He turned red. "I am sorry, but my visits to Mrs. Smith are only once yearly." "You have other friends here. You are always welcome here at Barton Cottage." He turned redder still, and with his eyes to the ground he replied, "You are too good." Mrs. Dashwood looked at Eleanor with surprise. Eleanor felt equal amazement. For a few moments, everyone was silent. Then Willoughby, with a small smile, said, "I cannot stay here any longer. I am sorry." He then quickly left the house and drove away. Mrs. Dashwood and Eleanor were amazed. Eleanor feared that Willoughby had never planned to marry Marianne, and that some unfortunate argument had happened between them. "It is all very strange, Mother. Last night he was with us so happy, so cheerful. Now he is gone without plans to return. Something more must have happened." "I think I know what has happened," replied Mrs. Dashwood. "I think that Mrs. Smith has heard of Willoughby's feelings for Marianne. She is not happy and has sent him on business as an excuse. Eleanor, you think poor Willoughby is guilty of something, don't you?" "I do not know, but his behavior was so strange just now. I cannot help it. It may be proper to hide their engagement, if they are engaged, from Mrs. Smith. If that is the case, I can see why Willoughby would leave. This is no excuse for their hiding it from us. Hiding it from us? Oh no, I am sure that they are engaged. But they have not told you. That is true. How strange this is. Do you think he has been acting a part in his behavior to your sister all this time? No, I cannot think that. He must and does love her, I am sure. Yet he left her so suddenly. But this does not make him guilty. If he could marry immediately, he would have told us of the engagement, I am sure. Their marriage cannot be for some time. It may be a good idea to keep it to themselves. They were interrupted by the entrance of Margaret. They saw nothing of Mary Ann until dinner time. She ate nothing, and after some time she burst into tears and left the room. If Mary Ann had been able to go to sleep that night, she could not have forgiven herself. She was awake the whole night, and she cried for most of it. The next evening, she played every favorite song that she had played to Willoughby. She spent whole hours at the piano singing and crying. The only books she read were those they used to read together. No letter from Willoughby came, and Mary Ann did not seem to be waiting for one. "Remember, Eleanor," said Mrs. Dashwood, "Sir John often brings our letters to us. If they are hiding their engagement, they would not want Sir John to see any letters." One morning, about a week after Willoughby had left, Mary Ann joined her sisters in their usual walk instead of walking away alone. Soon they saw a man on horseback riding toward them. "It is he," cried Mary Ann, and ran to meet him. I knew he would come. As the man came closer, however, they realized with surprise it was Edward Ferrars. He was the only person in the world who could be forgiven for not being Willoughby. They were all very happy to see him. Mary Ann asked Edward if he came directly from London. No, he had been in Devonshire a fortnight. "A fortnight?" she repeated, surprised that he had not come to see Eleanor earlier. "Now, Edward," Mary Ann said, "isn't our new home beautiful?" "Yes, it is," they continued in this way, asking Edward questions and receiving short replies. To Mary Ann, Edward seemed very uncomfortable and did not know what to say. This brought her back to thoughts of Willoughby, who was always so warm. Eleanor was very unhappy, half angry even, with his cold manner. Chapter 5. A Visit from Edward. Mrs. Dashwood was surprised only for a moment at seeing Edward. His coming to Barton was, in her opinion, very natural. He was warm to them, but he did not seem happy. The whole family saw it, but Mrs. Dashwood decided it must have something to do with his mother. "What are Mrs. Ferrars' views for you, Edward?" she said, when dinner was over and they were seated near the fire. "My mother knows I have no desire to be famous. I wish to be happy, but it must be in my own way. Money or greatness will not make me so." "What do money or greatness have to do with happiness?" cried Mary Ann. "Money can only give happiness where there is nothing else to give it. About £2,000 a year is enough to live on." Eleanor laughed. "2,000 a year! Mary Ann is as reasonable as ever, you see," said Eleanor. "She has not changed." "She is a little more serious than she was," replied Edward. "Edward," said Mary Ann, "you are not so happy yourself." "I know," said Edward, "that I am very shy. I am very uncomfortable in the company of other people. I must try not to be so shy." "But you would still be reserved," said Mary Ann. Edward seemed surprised. "Reserved? Am I reserved, Mary Ann?" "Yes, very." "I do not understand you," he replied, turning red. He sat for some time after that, silent and dull. It was clear to Eleanor that her friend was very unhappy. Also, she was unsure of his feelings for her. He joined her and Mary Ann in the breakfast room the next morning, before the others were down. Mary Ann soon left them together to talk. Before she was halfway upstairs, she heard the door open and, turning round, was surprised to see Edward come out. "I am going into the village to see my horses," he said, "as you are not yet ready for breakfast. I shall be back again soon." Later, when Edward took his tea from Mrs. Dashwood, Mary Ann noticed a ring with a piece of hair in the center of one of his fingers. "I never saw you wear a ring before, Edward," she cried. He turned red, and looking quickly at Eleanor replied, "It is my sister's hair." Eleanor was sure that the hair was her own, yet she was unsure how he had gotten it. She decided to take a closer look when she could. Before long, They were visited by Sir John and Mrs. Jennings. Sir John never came to the Dashwoods without either asking them to dinner at the park the next day or to drink tea with them that evening. This time, he asked them to both. "You must drink tea with us tonight," he said, "and tomorrow you must have dinner with us." Mrs. Jennings added, "There may be a dance, Miss Marianne." "A dance?" cried Marianne. "Impossible!" "What, you thought nobody could dance because a certain person is gone?" "I wish," cried Sir John, "that Willoughby was here again." "Who is Willoughby?" asked Edward in a low voice to Miss Dashwood. She gave him a short reply, but Marianne's face told him much more. Edward saw enough to understand. Marianne, turning red, said to him, "Oh, Edward, I am sure you will like him." "I am sure I will," he replied. Edward stayed at the cottage for 1 week. He was in better spirits by the end of his stay. He did not like to be at Norland. He hated being in town. But either to Norland or London, he must go. Eleanor was still unsure of his feelings toward her. His short visit and his decision to leave so soon were very confusing. "I think, Edward," said Mrs. Dashwood, as they were at breakfast the last morning, "you would be a happier man if you had a profession." "I have thought about this," he replied. "The church, the army, the law, the navy. I could never decide. So I entered Oxford, and have done very little ever since. It has not made me happy, though." This conversation added to the sadness of his leaving a short time later. Eleanor sat down as soon as he was out of the house, and kept herself busy all day. She tried not to think about Edward. While she sat thinking of him one morning, her eyes went to the window, and she saw people walking up to the door. Among them were Sir John and Lady Middleton, and Mrs. Jennings. But there were 2 others who she did not know. Mrs. Jennings came straight to the window. "Hello, my dear. I have brought my other son and daughter to see you. They came just last night." Lady Middleton introduced the 2 strangers. After Mrs. Dashwood and Margaret came downstairs, they all sat down to look at one another. Mrs. Palmer was several years younger than Lady Middleton. She was short and round and had a very pretty face. She came in with a smile, smiled all the time, except when she laughed, and smiled when she went away. Her husband was a serious man of about 26. He entered the room and, without speaking a word, took up a newspaper from the table and continued to read it as long as he stayed. "Well, what a lovely room this is," said Mrs. Palmer. "Only think, Mamma, how much it has changed. How I would like a house like this. Wouldn't you, Mr. Palmer?" Mr. Palmer made no answer as he continued reading the newspaper. "Mr. Palmer does not hear me," she said, laughing. Lady Middleton asked Mr. Palmer if there was any news in the paper. "No, none at all," he replied. "Here is Marianne," said Sir John. "Now, Palmer, here is a very pretty girl." Marianne came in, and Mrs. Jennings asked her if she had been to Allenham. Mrs. Palmer laughed to show she understood. Sir John asked them all to spend the next day at the park. They had no desire to see how Mr. and Mrs. Palmer ate their dinner, and did not think it would be a pleasant day. They tried to find an excuse, but in the end were made to go. As the Miss Dashwoods entered the park the next day, Mrs. Palmer came running in. "I am so glad to see you," she said. "We go away again tomorrow, but I hope we will meet again in town very soon." They told her they would not go to town this winter. The rest of the party soon came in. "So, Miss Marianne," said Sir John, "did you take your usual walk to Allenham today?" Marianne said nothing. "Oh, we know all about it," laughed Mrs. Palmer. "We live quite close to him in the country, you know. They say his house is a very pretty place." "As awful a spot as I ever saw in my life," said Mr. Palmer. Marianne was silent. "Is it?" continued Mrs. Palmer. "I must be thinking of somewhere else then." Then Mr. Palmer made some rude comment about Mrs. Jennings. "My love, you are quite rude today," said his wife. "Yes, but he may say what he likes," said Mrs. Jennings. "He has taken Charlotte off my hands and cannot give her back again." Charlotte laughed to think that her husband could not get rid of her. Eleanor did not think badly of Mr. Palmer. It seemed that he had become sour, for after being tricked by beauty, he was now the husband of a very silly woman. "Oh, Miss Dashwood," said Mrs. Palmer, "will you come and spend some time at Cleveland this Christmas?" They both quickly told her that it would not be possible. "But Eleanor, don't you like Mr. Palmer?" "Yes," said Eleanor. Well, he will be so disappointed if you don't come to Cleveland. Eleanor quickly asked if they saw much of Mr. Willoughby at Cleveland, and if they knew him well. Oh, yes, very well, replied Mrs. Palmer. I have heard your sister is to marry him. Mrs. Palmer! Oh, everybody is talking about it. I met Colonel Brandon in town, and he told me. That is very unlike him. He was well, I hope? Yes, and he did nothing but talk of you. You have known Colonel Brandon for a long time, haven't you? Oh, yes, I believe, she added in a low voice. He would have been very glad to have married me, if he could. I am happy with myself as I am. Mr. Palmer is the kind of man I like. Chapter 6. The Steele Sisters. One morning, Sir John invited the Miss Dashwoods to meet two young ladies who were related to Mrs. Jennings. When the Miss Dashwoods arrived at the park and met the young Miss Steeles, they found that the eldest, who was nearly 30, was not beautiful, but the other, who was not more than 23, was very pretty. Eleanor soon noticed how they were making Lady Middleton like them by playing with the children and laughing at their tricks. John is in such spirits today, said Lady Middleton, about John taking Miss Steeles's pocket handkerchief and throwing it out of the window. Here is my little Anna Maria, she added, to a little girl of 3 years old. She is always so quiet. Little Anna Maria soon began screaming violently. She screamed and was carried out of the room, leaving the four young ladies in a refreshingly quiet room. What a lovely little family they have, said Lucy Steele. I never saw such beautiful children in my life, and I do love children. I can see that, said Eleanor with a smile. Miss Steele suddenly asked, How do you like Devonshire, Miss Dashwood? I suppose you were very sorry to leave Sussex. Eleanor replied that she was. Norland is a very beautiful place, isn't it? Added Lucy. Did many young men come to visit there? Asked Miss Steele. I suppose your brother was quite a catch, Miss Dashwood, before he married, as he was so rich. Anne, cried her sister, you can talk of nothing but men. You will make Miss Dashwood believe you think of nothing else. She began talking insincerely about the house and furniture. Eleanor and Marianne left the house that day without any wish of knowing the Miss Steeles better. Unfortunately, Sir John liked them very much, and told the Miss Steeles a number of things about the Miss Dashwoods. One afternoon, the eldest congratulated Eleanor on her sister's having been so lucky to find a man since she came to Barton. I hear he is very handsome, she said, and I hear you too have a friend. His name is Ferrars, said Sir John, not very quietly. Ferrars, repeated Miss Steele. Your sister-in-law's brother, Miss Dashwood? I know him very well. Anne, how can you say that? Cried Lucy Steele to her sister. We have seen him once or twice at my uncle's. We do not know him very well. Eleanor heard all this with surprise. Who was this uncle? Where did he live? Later on, Lucy was walking from the park to the cottage with Eleanor. Lucy said, You will think my question is strange, but do you know your sister-in-law's mother, Mrs. Ferrars? I thought you must have seen her at Norland. Eleanor did think that the question was unusual. No, returned Eleanor, I know nothing of her. They walked on for a few minutes in silence. I'm sorry, Lucy asked again. But are you very sure that you do not know Mrs. Ferrars? I'm sorry I do not, said Eleanor with great surprise, and I wonder why my opinion is so important to you. I'm surprised that you're so seriously interested in her character when you don't know her. Well, I do not know her now, but a time may come when we know each other very well. She looked down as she said this. What do you mean? Cried Eleanor. Do you know Mr. Robert Ferrars? Can it be possible that you are engaged to him? No, replied Lucy. Not to Mr. Robert Ferrars, she said with her eyes on Eleanor, to his eldest brother. Eleanor turned toward Lucy in silent amazement. You may be surprised, continued Lucy, because I am sure he never spoke of it with you or any of your family. None of my relations know of it but Anne. May I ask if you have been engaged a long time? We have been engaged for 4 years. 4 years? Yes. He lived for 4 years with my uncle, who lives at Longstaple near Plymouth. It was there we became engaged. Eleanor could not believe Lucy's story at all. I am sure we cannot mean the same Mr. Ferrars. I have never heard him speak of you. Lucy took a small portrait of Mr. Ferrars from her pocket. Please, look at this face. I think you will then know that it is the same man we speak of." She put it into her hands as she spoke. Eleanor immediately saw that it was of Edward. "I am sure," said Lucy, "that you will keep our secret, for his mother will never agree to our engagement. I have no money, you see." Eleanor just looked at Lucy. "It has been 4 years already, Miss Dashwood. What do you think we should do? What would you do?" "I do not know," replied Eleanor, very hurt by the question. "He was so sad about it when he left us to go to you," said Lucy. "Then did he come from your uncle's when he visited us?" "Oh yes, he had been staying a fortnight with us. Look, here is a letter he wrote me," she said, holding out a letter to Eleanor. "Letters," she continued, "are the only comfort we have. I did give him a piece of my hair in a ring when he was at Longstaple. Did you notice it?" "I did," said Eleanor, angry and amazed. They had reached the cottage, though, and so ended the conversation. The picture, the letter, the ring, Edward's visit near Plymouth, his manner when he arrived at Barton Cottage. These all pointed to the truth of Lucy's story. Surely he loved her. How could he possibly be happy with a wife like Lucy Steele? Illogical, shallow, selfish, and with no education. And she had even less money than Eleanor herself. For Edward's mother, this engagement would be worse than his engagement to Eleanor. Some days later, the young ladies went to dinner at Barton Park. After dinner, they went into the next room where Marianne went straight to the piano. Lady Middleton turned to Lucy. "I am glad," she said. "You are not going to finish that basket for poor little Anna Maria this evening. I am sure it will hurt your eyes to work by candlelight. She will not be too disappointed." Lucy understood immediately. "Oh no, Lady Middleton. I was just about to work on the basket." "Oh, you are very good. Will you ring the bell for some more candles? Perhaps I could help Lucy?" asked Eleanor. "Oh, that would be lovely," said Lucy. They were soon seated side by side at the same table. With Marianne playing loudly and Miss Dashwood distracted, Eleanor could speak to Lucy without being heard. Eleanor said, "I appreciate you sharing the secret with me, so it would be rude of me not to discuss it further with you." "Oh," cried Lucy, "I was worried I had made you angry. There seemed to me to be a coldness and displeasure in your manner, as if you were angry with me." "I am glad you trusted me," replied Eleanor. "You are in an awful situation. I believe that Mr. Ferrars is financially dependent on his mother. He has only £2,000 of his own. We cannot marry on that. We must wait many years." "Well," said Eleanor, "your love must be very strong to last so long." "Edward's love for me," said Lucy, "has been put to the test by long periods apart from each other, and he has never given me one moment's alarm. I can be very jealous, and would have found out the truth immediately." "But what?" said Eleanor after a short silence. "Will you do? Just wait for Mrs. Ferrars' death? Could you not tell her the truth?" "Oh no, she would give everything to his brother Robert." There was a sudden pause in Marianne's music. "I think they are talking about men again," said Lucy's sister Anne. "Well, Miss Dashwood's, I know," said Mrs. Jennings, laughing. "But as for Lucy, there is no finding out who she likes." There was a long silence. At last Lucy spoke. "I believe it might be best to end the engagement. Perhaps we would be happier in the end. What do you think, Miss Dashwood? I do believe that if you said to me, 'Lucy, you must end your engagement with Edward Ferrars,' I would do so immediately." Eleanor blushed at the insincerity of Edward's future wife. There was another long silence. "Will you be in town this winter, Miss Dashwood?" Lucy asked. "No." "How unlucky that is," she replied, looking very pleased. "Edward will be there in February." The conversation soon ended with both girls liking each other even less than they did before. Eleanor was sure that Lucy did not sincerely love Edward, and that their long engagement was making neither of them happy. Unfortunately for Eleanor, the Miss Steeles stayed nearly 2 months at Barton Park. Chapter 7. A Trip to London. Though Mrs. Jennings spent a large part of the year at the houses of her children and friends, she also had a home of her own in London. One day in January, quite suddenly, she asked the elder Miss Dashwoods to go with her to town. At first, Eleanor told her that it would not be possible, as they could not leave their mother. "Oh, I am sure your mother will be fine," said Mrs. Jennings. "I have had such good luck in getting my own children off my hands. I am sure I can get at least one of you well married. I will speak a good word for you to all the young men in London." Eleanor saw that Mary Ann would do anything, even put up with the manners of Mrs. Jennings, to be with Willoughby again. She replied that it was their mother's decision. She also knew that whatever Mary Ann was desirous of, her mother would be happy to give. "I am delighted with the plan," cried Mrs. Dashwood, when they told her. "It is very right that young ladies should go to London." "If Eleanor does not want to go with Mrs. Jennings," said Mary Ann, "it does not mean that I shouldn't go. I am sure I could put up with every unpleasantness." Mrs. Jennings was very happy when they told her. Sir John was delighted, and even Lady Middleton took the trouble of being delighted. As for the Miss Steeles, especially Lucy, they had never been so happy in their lives. They left in the first week in January, and it took them 3 days to get to London. Eleanor spent much of her time talking to Mrs. Jennings, as Mary Ann was silent, lost in her own thoughts. Looking at her sister's face, so full of excitement and hope, Eleanor could not help feeling that she had very little to look forward to. They reached town by 3 o'clock the third day, glad to be out of the carriage and ready to enjoy a good fire. The house was very handsome, and the young ladies were given Charlotte's old apartment. While waiting for dinner, Eleanor sat down to write a letter to their mother. Mary Ann also wrote a letter very quickly. Eleanor noticed a large W in the address. Mary Ann rang the bell to have someone post it immediately. After dinner, the tea things had just been brought in when there was a loud knock at the door. Mary Ann cried, "Oh, Eleanor, it is Willoughby," and seemed almost ready to throw herself into his arms when Colonel Brandon came in. She was so surprised, she immediately left the room. Eleanor was embarrassed that he guessed that Mary Ann felt nothing but disappointment in seeing him. "Is your sister sick?" he said. Eleanor answered that she was. With very little interest on either side, they continued to talk. Mrs. Jennings soon came in. "Oh, Colonel," said she, with her usual noisy cheerfulness, "I am so glad to see you. How did you hear that I was in town today?" "I had the pleasure of hearing it at Mr. Palmer's. She is looking forward to seeing you tomorrow." Eleanor now began to make the tea, and Mary Ann came back in. Colonel Brandon became more thoughtful and silent than he had been before, and did not stay long. No other visitor came that evening, and the ladies went early to bed. The next morning, Mrs. Palmer arrived. Mary Ann was in a better mood, and greeted Mrs. Palmer by saying, "Mr. Palmer will be so happy to see you." After an hour or two spent talking, the ladies decided to go with Mrs. Palmer to the shops on Bond Street. Yet nothing gave Mary Ann any pleasure, and she only wanted to be at home again. As soon as they returned home, Mary Ann flew upstairs. There was no news from Willoughby. "Has no letter been left here for me since we went out?" she asked the man who entered with the parcels. The man replied that none had. "How strange," she said, in a low and disappointed voice. "How strange," repeated Eleanor. If she had not known he was in town, she would not have written to him. And how strange that he should neither come nor write. She decided that, if this unpleasantness continued for many days, she would tell her mother about the situation. Colonel Brandon came to the house almost every day. He came to look at Mary Ann and to talk to Eleanor, who liked talking to him very much. About a week after their arrival, they saw that Mr. Willoughby's card was on the table when they came in from the morning's drive. "He has been here while we were out," said Mary Ann. "He will call again tomorrow," replied Eleanor. Mary Ann decided to stay behind the next morning, when the others went out. One look at her sister when they returned was enough to tell Eleanor that Willoughby had not called. A note was just then brought in and laid on the table. "For me!" cried Mary Ann. Unfortunately, it was for Mrs. Jennings. "You are expecting a letter, then?" asked Eleanor. "Yes, a little." "Much," she said after a short pause. "You do not trust me, Mary Ann." "Ha, Eleanor, you do not trust anyone." "Mary Ann," returned Eleanor, "I have nothing to tell." "Neither of us have anything to tell," answered Mary Ann. The next day, Colonel Brandon came to tea. Mary Ann, who had seen him from the window, left the room before he entered it. He looked as if he had something important to tell Miss Dashwood, yet he sat for some time without saying a word. He tried to smile as he said, "Your sister's engagement to Mr. Willoughby is very well known." "It cannot be well known," returned Eleanor, "for her own family does not know it." He looked surprised and said, "I am sorry, but I did not realize it was a secret." I have heard it talked about by many. I came to ask, is everything decided? Is it impossible to? Excuse me, Miss Dashwood. I believe I have been wrong in saying so much." From these words, Eleanor was sure that the Colonel was very much in love with her sister, yet she knew Colonel Brandon could never be successful with her. She told the Colonel that she was sure that Marianne and Willoughby loved each other, although they had not heard any news of an engagement. He listened to her with silent attention, and, when she finished, stood and said, "To your sister, I wish every happiness. To Willoughby, that he may one day be good enough for her," and went away. Over the next 3 or 4 days, Willoughby neither came nor wrote. One evening, they were invited to go to a party with Lady Middleton. They arrived at the beautiful house where the party was to be held, went up the stairs, and heard their names spoken as they entered. The room was well lit, full of people and terribly hot. After meeting the lady of the house, they went to sit down. Suddenly, Eleanor saw Willoughby standing very close to them in deep conversation with a very fashionable young woman. She turned to Marianne, who had just seen him. "He is there! He is there! Oh, why does he not look at me? Why can't I speak to him?" "Marianne," said Eleanor, "perhaps he has not seen you yet." At last he turned and looked at them both. He came to them but spoke to Eleanor rather than Marianne, as if wishing not to catch her eye, and quickly asked about Mrs. Dashwood. Marianne, turning red, cried, "Willoughby, what is wrong? Did you not get my letters? Won't you look at me?" After a moment's pause, he spoke. "I came by last Tuesday, but unfortunately did not see you or Mrs. Jennings. My card was not lost, I hope." "Have you not received my notes?" cried Marianne. "Tell me, Willoughby, tell me, what is the matter?" He was quiet and very embarrassed. The young he was speaking with looked at him and he said, "Yes, I had the pleasure of hearing of your arrival in town and your letters," turned quickly away and joined his friend. Marianne, turning white and unable to stand, fell into her chair. Eleanor immediately went to Lady Middleton and told her that Marianne was unwell. They quickly left the party and returned silently to Mrs. Jennings' house. Eleanor was amazed. She was sure that there had been some kind of engagement between Willoughby and Marianne, but it seemed Willoughby no longer felt the same way. Yet his embarrassment showed that he knew he was behaving badly. Their long absence might have changed his feelings for her, but how horrible a way for Marianne to learn this news, in the middle of a party. Chapter 8. The Truth About Mr. Willoughby. Before the housemaid had lit their fire the next day, Marianne was up and next to the light of the window. Eleanor was sure that she was writing her final letter to Willoughby. After breakfast, a letter came for Marianne. Turning white, she took it and ran from the room. Mrs. Jennings saw only that Marianne had received a letter from Willoughby, which appeared to her a very good joke. "I am sure I never saw a young woman so in love in my life." Eleanor found Marianne on her bed, one letter in her hand, and 2 or 3 others near her. Marianne, unable to speak, put all the letters into Eleanor's hands, then covered her face with her handkerchief, almost screaming. Eleanor turned to the first letter. "My dear madam, I have just read your letter, and I am much surprised if there was anything in my behavior yesterday evening that caused you alarm, and though I am quite unsure of what I may have done, I ask you to forgive me. I always think of my time with your family in Devonshire with happiness, but if I have made you believe I felt more than I felt, I would be very sorry. My feelings have long been elsewhere, and it will not be many weeks before I am engaged. I now return to you your letters and the piece of hair which you were so kind to give me. John Willoughby." You may imagine how amazed Miss Dashwood was with this letter. How different this Willoughby was to the one that had spent time with them at Barton Cottage. She read it again and again, but every time it only served to make her hate him more and more. "Oh, Eleanor, I am so sad," said Marianne, before her voice was lost in her crying. "Happy, happy Eleanor, you do not understand. Ah, if you knew, Marianne, but sister, as sad as it is now, think if your engagement had continued for months and months, and then he chose to put an end to it." "Engagement!" cried Marianne. "We were never engaged." "But he told you that he loved you." "Yes, no, never for sure." "Yet you wrote letters to him?" "Yes, is that so wrong?" Eleanor said no more and turned to the other 3 letters. They were letters Marianne had written to Willoughby after they had arrived in London. How could a man answer such warmly written letters in such a manner? "I wrote to him because I thought we were to be married," said Marianne. "I can believe it," said Eleanor, "but unfortunately, he did not feel the same." "He did feel the same, Eleanor. I know he did. Willoughby, whose heart I know so well. How could you do such evil?" Mrs. Jennings came immediately to their room on her return from town. "How are you, my dear?" she asked. Marianne turned her face away. "How is she, Miss Dashwood?" "She looks very bad. It is true he is to be married. Mrs. Taylor told me half an hour ago, and she was told by a friend of Miss Grey herself. If only I could tell him what I think of him." That evening at dinner, Mrs. Jennings was as kind to Marianne as possible, gave her lovely things to eat, and the best place by the fire. Marianne did her best, but after some time burst into tears and left the room. "Poor girl," cried Mrs. Jennings as soon as she was gone. "If only I could do something to help her. His behavior is very strange indeed. But when there is money on one side and little on the other. The lady then, Miss Grey, is very rich?" £50,000, my dear. A fashionable girl, they say, but not beautiful. Do you know what kind of a girl Miss Grey is? I do not know, although I am sure the family taking care of her, the Ellisons, will be pleased to have her married. Oh, how surprised Sir John and my daughters will be when I tell them tomorrow. I hope they will not talk of Mr. Willoughby in front of Marianne. Oh no, they are very thoughtful. I am glad to hear it, for it is true that they were never engaged. Never engaged? But he took her all over Allenham House, through the rooms they were to live in. Colonel Brandon came in while the party was at tea, sat down near Miss Dashwood, and asked after her sister. "Marianne is not well," she said. "Perhaps then," he carefully replied, "what I heard this morning may be true." "Yes," answered Eleanor, "it is true. Where did you hear it?" "When I was shopping today in town." "How is your sister?" "She has not been well. Until yesterday she knew nothing of it at all. He has behaved most terribly." "Ah," said Colonel Brandon, "he has indeed." Mrs. Jennings thought it strange that the colonel did not seem any happier to learn Marianne was no longer engaged. Mrs. Jennings went out alone the next morning. After a short time, there was a knock at the door. Marianne moved to the window. "It is Colonel Brandon," she said. "We are never safe from him." He soon came in. "I have something to tell you," he said. After saying, "I believe it will be very interesting for your sister," he stopped. "Please go on," said Eleanor. "Miss Dashwood, you might remember a conversation we had, in which I told you of a lady I had once known, and how she looked very much like your sister Marianne." "Indeed," answered Eleanor, "I do remember." He looked pleased. "We played together as children. Eliza was always very dear to me, and I cannot remember a time when I did not love her. Yet at 17, she was married to my brother. She had a large amount of money, and my family was in trouble. Unfortunately, my brother did not love her and treated her very badly. She was very unhappy. And 2 years afterward, I heard they had divorced. I was overseas and could do little to help her." He stopped and walked around the room. He saw Eleanor's surprise and, walking to her, took her hand and kissed it. 3 years later, I returned to England. It was very difficult to find her. She had no money, and when I found her, she was in a poor, dirty hospital, close to death. I could not believe this was the same lovely, healthy girl I had loved. I was with her when she died. When I met your sister, I immediately thought of Eliza." He was silent for a time. "There is more to the story," he continued. "Eliza left in my care her only child, a little girl. I had no family, no home, and so I sent my little Eliza to a school, and saw her there whenever I could. I know many people think she is a much closer relation than she is, but last February she suddenly disappeared. The first news that reached me of her came in a letter from her last October. It was the same letter that caused me to leave for London so suddenly. Mr. Willoughby had tricked my dear Eliza, leaving her pregnant and in the most terrible situation. He had left her, promising to return. He neither returned nor wrote." "No," cried Eleanor. "Now you know his true character. Knowing all this myself, when I heard he was engaged to your sister, I needed to know the truth. My behavior must have seemed strange, but now you know why. But your sister may think herself lucky when she knows of my poor Eliza. You may tell her as much or as little of this as you wish." Eleanor thanked him for telling her. "I am sure that when she knows this, She will think very differently of him." After Colonel Brandon left the house, Miss Dashwood told her sister the Colonel's story, and Marianne cried more tears than ever. It made her very sad to know that he had left another girl in such a terrible situation, and that he tried to fool Marianne as well. Soon after, a letter came from Mrs. Dashwood. She was surprised and alarmed at the news, yet she did not think it a good idea for them to return to Barton. She told her daughters to stay in London, where there was more to keep them busy. Early in February, within a fortnight of Willoughby's letter, Eleanor told her sister that he was married. Luckily, the Willoughbys left town soon after. About this time, the two Miss Steeles arrived. "How happy I am to see you still in town," said Lucy Steele. "You told me at Barton that you would not stay longer than a month. I am so glad that you didn't keep your word." Eleanor understood Miss Steele perfectly. Chapter 9. A Secret. Marianne agreed to go out with Eleanor and Mrs. Jennings one morning for half an hour. They went to Gray's jewelry store on Sackville Street, where Eleanor had some shopping to do for her mother. When they entered, the shop was very busy. They waited behind a young man in the hope that he would finish up quickly, but he was giving orders for a toothpick case for himself and stood for over a quarter of an hour looking at every toothpick case in the shop. When he left, Eleanor saw that he did not have a handsome face, although he was fashionably dressed. Suddenly, Eleanor saw a man to her side and, turning to look, found with surprise that it was her brother. He was very happy to see them. "I am sorry I have not visited you yet," he said. "You must introduce me to your friend Mrs. Jennings. I understand she is a very rich woman. The Middletons, too. You must introduce me to them. With such rich neighbors, I am sure you want for nothing." Mr. Dashwood came the next day without his wife. Colonel Brandon came soon after, and Mr. Dashwood watched him very carefully. After staying with them half an hour, he asked Eleanor to walk with him to Conduit Street, and introduced him to Sir John and Lady Middleton. "Who is Colonel Brandon?" he asked as they walked. "Is he a rich man?" "Yes, he has very good property in Dorsetshire." "I'm glad. I think, Eleanor, you will have a very happy life together." "Ha! I am very sure that Colonel Brandon has no wish of marrying me. I am sure he does. It will be a very happy day for all of us. It would be quite funny," he continued, "if Fanny should have a brother, and I a sister marrying at the same time." "Is Mr. Edward Ferrars going to be married?" asked Eleanor. "It is not quite decided. The lady is the Honourable Miss Morton, only daughter of the late Lord Morton, with £30,000. Tell me, Eleanor, what is the matter with Marianne? Is she ill? She looked beautiful last September, and Fanny used to say that she would marry sooner and better than you would. Now, though, she will be lucky to marry a man with more than 500 or 600 a year." Eleanor knew that if they married well, her brother would be able to excuse himself for behaving so badly following the death of their father. They were lucky enough to find Lady Middleton at home, and Sir John came in before their visit ended. "Fanny will be very pleased," he said happily, as he walked back with his sister. Mrs. John Dashwood visited both Mrs. Jennings and her mother the very next day, and found both of them very charming. Indeed, the John Dashwoods were so delighted with the Middletons that though they did not have much food, they decided to give them a dinner. They invited the Miss Dashwoods, Mrs. Jennings, Colonel Brandon, and the Miss Steeles. Eleanor was very excited to meet Mrs. Ferrars, Edward's mother. Lucy Steele was very pleased to be invited, as it was her desire to become well known to Edward's family. "Oh, Miss Dashwood," said Lucy when they arrived, hoping to make Eleanor jealous, "in a moment I will see the person that is to be my mother." Mrs. Ferrars was a little thin woman with a sour face. She eyed Miss Dashwood with dislike throughout dinner. Eleanor could not now be made unhappy by this behavior, although a few months ago it would have hurt her very much, if only she knew that Edward and Lucy were engaged. It was a grand dinner. The only thing missing was the conversation. When the ladies went to another room after dinner, the only thing they had to talk of were the heights of Harry Dashwood and Lady Middleton's second son William, who were nearly of the same age. The two mothers, though each really thought that her own son was taller, politely decided that the other was. The two grandmothers decided that their own grandson was taller. Lucy, wanting to please both parents, thought that both boys were very tall for their age. Marianne told them she did not know, as she had never thought about it. Luckily, the men came in. and John Dashwood handed Colonel Brandon a pretty painting of Eleanor's. "This was done by my eldest sister," he said. The colonel agreed that it was very well drawn, and it was then passed around the room. Said Mrs. Ferrars, "very pretty," and without looking at it, returned it to her daughter. Fanny looked at her mother and said, "Do you not think it is like Miss Morton's paintings? She does paint delightfully." "Beautifully indeed, but she does everything well," Marianne burst out. "What is Miss Morton to us? Who cares for her? It is of Eleanor that we think and speak." Mrs. Ferrars looked very angry. "Poor Marianne," said her brother to Colonel Brandon in a low voice. "You would not think it, but Marianne was very beautiful a few months ago. As beautiful as Eleanor, but now you see it is all gone." The next morning, Lucy arrived at the house. Mrs. Jennings was out, and Marianne in her room, leaving Eleanor and Lucy alone. "My dear friend," said Lucy, "wasn't Mrs. Ferrars lovely to me yesterday? I was so very happy to see it." "But she does not know of your engagement." "I know that," replied Lucy quickly, "but even so, I am sure it will all end well." At that moment the door was thrown open, and Edward Ferrars walked in. It was a very uncomfortable moment indeed. Edward looked as though he wanted to walk back out again. Eleanor welcomed him and tried hard to make him comfortable. She made polite conversation. Lucy said nothing, but Eleanor knew her eyes were watching her. Eleanor decided to leave the two of them alone and went to find Marianne. Marianne came in, her pleasure in seeing him openly expressed, and she met him like a brother. "Edward!" she cried. "This is a moment of great happiness." Again they all sat down, and Marianne looked at Edward and Eleanor and back again, hoping that Lucy would soon go and leave them alone. "Where were you yesterday, Edward?" she asked. "I was engaged elsewhere." "Perhaps, Miss Marianne," cried Lucy, "you think young men never keep their engagements, little as well as great." Soon after this meeting, Mrs. Palmer had a baby boy. Mrs. Jennings visited her daughter every day, and this left her young friends to spend their hours with Lady Middleton and the two Miss Steeles. Though Lady Middleton was always polite to Eleanor and Marianne, she did not really like them at all. Lucy Steele, of course, did not like them either. All these jealousies and dislikes, however, were unknown to Mrs. Jennings, who thought it a delightful thing for the girls to be together. One evening, they were invited to a musical party at the home of a friend of Mrs. John Dashwood. It was not a very interesting evening. There were some people there who loved music, but a great many more who knew nothing about it at all. Looking over at a group of young men, Eleanor noticed the man who had bought the toothpick case at Gray's. She saw that he was looking at her and speaking to her brother. They came over to her, and Mr. Dashwood introduced him to her as Mr. Robert Ferrars. She immediately saw that he was very different than his brother. "You reside in Devonshire, I hear," he said, "in a cottage. If I had lots of money, I would build a cottage. My friend, Lord Courtland, came to me the other day with 3 plans for a house. I threw them all into the fire and said, 'Build a cottage.' Last month, I was at my friend Elliot's home near Dartford. Lady Elliot wished to give a dance, and I told her she could hold a dance comfortably in a cottage. Eleanor agreed, not wanting a longer conversation. Later that evening, John Dashwood told his wife he was thinking of having the Miss Dashwoods stay with them, as Mrs. Jennings was now so busy. Fanny paused a moment and then said, "My love, I just remembered that I asked the Miss Steeles to spend a few days with us. They are such lovely girls. We can ask your sisters some other year, but the Miss Steeles may not be in town again. You do like them, don't you?" Mr. Dashwood agreed with his wife that they should invite the Miss Steeles immediately and ask his sisters another year. Lucy was so happy. It seemed Mrs. Dashwood was working for her, herself. Now she could be close to Edward and his family. Chapter 10. Love or Money. One morning, Mrs. Jennings burst into the room where Eleanor was sitting. "My dear Miss Dashwood, have you heard the news? Mr. Edward Ferrars is engaged to Lucy Steele." No one knew of it but her sister, who told Mrs. Dashwood. Fanny was beside herself and immediately threw both of them out of the house. Can you believe it? I feel so sorry for poor Lucy. I do not see why she shouldn't be married to Edward Ferrars. But it seems all his family is interested in is money. Eleanor felt very sorry for Edward, but did not feel very sorry for Lucy. As Mrs. Jennings could talk about nothing else, Eleanor knew she needed to tell Marianne the truth about her and Edward. It was difficult to tell her sister, as Marianne thought of Edward as a second Willoughby and was sure of their love for each other. She also disliked Lucy and did not see how a man like Edward could possibly love her. "Oh, Eleanor and you comforted me while you were so unhappy. I will hate myself forever," replied her sister. Eleanor made her promise not to show any dislike toward Lucy or to act differently to Edward. The next morning, their brother came to visit. "You have heard the news?" he said seriously. "Your sister Fanny," he continued, "is beside herself. She only wished to show the two girls some kindness. When Mrs. Ferrars found out, she told him immediately to break off the engagement. She promised him 1,000 a year, then 1,200 to break it off, but he said no." "Then," cried Mrs. Jennings sincerely, "he has acted like an honest man." John Dashwood, surprised by this, said, "Miss Lucy Steele is, I am sure, a nice young lady, but you must know that it is impossible for them to marry. Edward has made his decision, and it is a very bad one. His mother decided this morning that everything will now go to his brother, and there is nothing more we can do to help him." "Poor young man," cried Mrs. Jennings. Sir John left soon after, and all three women began to talk of Mrs. Ferrars, the Dashwoods, and Edward. None of them could believe how his family had behaved. Several days later, Eleanor and Mrs. Jennings joined some friends at Kensington Gardens. It was a fine day, even though it was only the second week in March. Suddenly, Anne Steele came to them. Mrs. Jennings immediately whispered to Eleanor, "Find out everything, my dear." "I am so glad to meet you," said Miss Steele. "Is Mrs. Jennings angry with us? Is Lady Middleton angry?" "Not at all," said Eleanor. "That is a good thing. My sister was so angry with me at first. People may say what they like about Edward, but he is a good man. He told his family that he loved nobody but Lucy. He told her this morning that he understood if she wanted to end it, as he would now have no money. But she told him she wasn't going anywhere. Then he was very happy and told her that he would become a bishop and earn his money, but that they would have to wait until then to be married. I heard all this when I was listening at the door." "At the door?" cried Eleanor. "Oh, it's fine. What an awful woman his mother is, and your brother and sister were not very kind." Miss Steele was about to say more when her party called her to join them. As soon as they returned to the carriage, Mrs. Jennings asked Eleanor what she had learned. Eleanor only told her that the engagement continued and that the wedding would wait until Edward entered the church. "Wait for that? But it is impossible. They will have a child every year, and how poor they will be." The Miss Dashwoods had now been more than 2 months in town, and Marianne's desire to go home increased every day. She wanted the clean air, the freedom, and the quiet of the country. The Palmers were to go to Cleveland at the end of March, and invited the Miss Dashwoods to go with them. They agreed, as Barton was 1 day's drive from Cleveland. "Ah, Colonel," said Mrs. Jennings, as he visited the next day, "I do not know what you and I will do without the Miss Dashwoods after they go home." Colonel Brandon moved to Eleanor, who was standing by the fire. "Is it true," he said, "that your friend Mr. Ferrars has been sent away from his family for keeping his engagement to a young woman?" Eleanor told him that it was. "It is a terrible situation. I have seen Mr. Ferrars, and he seemed to be a very good young man. I hear he is to enter the church. Will you be so good as to tell him that there is a job just opened at Delaford, and if it would please him, he can take it. It is only a small church, but it pleases me to give it to him." The colonel asking Eleanor's hand in marriage would not have amazed her more than this. The situation they all thought impossible could now happen. She thanked him with all her heart. Mrs. Jennings, from the other side of the room, saw the expression of feeling from both sides and was sure the colonel had just asked Eleanor to marry him. "Well, Miss Dashwood," said Mrs. Jennings, smiling, as soon as the colonel had left, "I have never been more pleased in my life." "Yes," said Eleanor, "it is very happy news indeed." "Oh, I am not surprised at all." Mrs. Jennings got up to go out. "You must tell your sister." "I will, but please do not tell anyone else," replied Eleanor. Soon after she had gone, Edward himself arrived at the house. They both felt very embarrassed. "Mrs. Jennings told me," said Edward, "that you wished to speak with me." "Yes, I have some news for you. Colonel Brandon, who was here only 10 minutes ago, asked me to tell you of an opening in the church at Delaford, and that it is yours if you desire it. He is a good man and very sincerely wished for your happiness." Edward looked very surprised. Colonel Brandon, can it be possible? The unkindness of your own relations has made you amazed to find kindness anywhere. I must hurry to thank him, he said, standing up. He has made me a very happy man. When I see him again, said Eleanor to herself, as the door closed, he will be the husband of Lucy. When Mrs. Jennings came home, she went straight to Eleanor. So tell me, my dear, when is the marriage? How long will the colonel wait? It is not his decision. Whatever do you mean? Then they saw that there had been a misunderstanding, and both of them laughed. Mrs. Jennings was still very pleased to hear of the colonel's news. Edward, having given his thanks to Colonel Brandon, went to tell Lucy the good news. She was amazed and agreed that Colonel Brandon was the kindest man who ever lived. Eleanor thought it was time to go and see Mrs. Dashwood. Marianne and Mrs. Jennings would not go. Eleanor went alone to the house to find that Mrs. Dashwood could not meet her. As she went to leave, Mr. Dashwood came out. Eleanor, do come in. Fanny will be so pleased to see you. They entered the house, but Fanny did not come out. She must be in her room. But tell me, is it true about Colonel Brandon? Yes, it is. How amazing to do that for someone he does not know. How much will Edward get? About 200 a year, said Eleanor. Well, he is a very lucky man. Do not say anything to Fanny. And Mrs. Ferrars knows nothing of it. It would make her very unhappy. After a short pause, Mr. Dashwood said, We think that Robert will marry Miss Morton. He is the eldest son now. One more thing, dear sister, he continued in a low voice. Mrs. Ferrars told me that she would have been happier to hear of Edward's engagement to another girl. She said that girl would have been far better. I hope that this news will please you. This awful conversation was interrupted by the entrance of Mr. Robert Ferrars. John Dashwood left to find his wife, leaving the two of them together. He soon began to speak of Edward, laughing at the idea of his brother reading prayers and marrying the locals in a little church. It is very funny, he said, but not for poor Edward. She is a country girl without style or charm. He had just said this when Mrs. John Dashwood came in, putting an end to the conversation. She never spoke of Edward, but Eleanor could see that he was always on her mind. Chapter 11. Willoughby's Confession. Very early in April, they all arrived at Cleveland for the Easter holiday. Marianne entered the house knowing she was only 80 miles from Barton and not 30 from Combe Magna, Willoughby's house. She soon went to the hills to see if she could see either of them. Unfortunately, 2 evening walks in the rain gave Marianne a violent cold. She went to bed early, telling them all a good sleep would make her better. She got up the next morning at her usual time, but sat all day by the fire, looking very sick. The next morning, Eleanor called for the Palmers' doctor. He came, said the word infection, and caused such alarm to Mrs. Palmer that she took her baby and went to stay with friends in Bath. Marianne did not get any better the next day, and so Mr. Palmer went to join his wife. Mrs. Jennings told the colonel she needed him there in case of an emergency, and he was convinced to stay with her. On the evening of the 3rd day, Marianne became more heavy and uncomfortable than before. Eleanor sat with her until she fell asleep. As she slept, she cried out, "Is Mamma coming?" "Not yet," said the other, very alarmed. Eleanor went to talk with Colonel Brandon about having their mother visit. He told her that he would go himself to get Mrs. Dashwood. How glad Eleanor was for the comfort of such a friend. The doctor came again the next day, but nothing he did worked. She only hoped that Colonel Brandon would bring their mother soon. Around noon, there was a change for the better in Marianne. She could open her eyes and seemed to have a little more color. When the doctor came at 5 o'clock, he told them she was out of danger. The night was cold and windy. It was raining hard. At 8 o'clock, Eleanor heard a carriage arrive. It was drawn by 4 horses. Eleanor hurried downstairs to meet her mother and saw only Willoughby. Eleanor jumped back. "Miss Dashwood," he cried, "your sister is out of danger. I am so glad to hear it. Is it really true?" Eleanor would not speak. "Tell me, is she out of danger or is she not?" "We hope she is." "Well, that is good news. Why don't we be cheerful together? It may be the last time." Eleanor looked at him amazed. She began to think he had been drinking. "Yes," he said with an expressive smile, "I am very drunk. I stopped at Marlborough for dinner, and—" "At Marlborough?" cried Eleanor. "Yes, I left London this morning at 8 o'clock. Why would you come here from London?" "I came he said, to ask for your sister's forgiveness. You did? Well, she has already forgiven you. Has she? He cried. I do not know how she could, but do listen to me. When I first met your family, I only meant to pass my time pleasantly in Devonshire. I thought your sister was lovely, but careless of her happiness. I tried to make myself pleasing to her with no desire of returning her feelings. Mr. Willoughby, I cannot hear any more. You must listen, he replied. I have never had much money, and there was no way for me to get more other than marrying well. So you see, I did just that, and in doing so, gave up any chance of feeling again the happiness I felt with Marianne. So you did have feelings for Marianne? Yes, of course. The happiest hours of my life were those spent with her. I could not enter in an engagement with her when my situation was so embarrassing. The days passed, and I decided that with Mrs. Smith's help, I could possibly marry Marianne. Then, before I could talk with your sister alone, Mrs. Smith found out about another unfortunate situation. I am sure you have already heard of it. He turned red. I have, replied Eleanor. Your behavior to that unfortunate girl is as unpleasant as it is to talk about it with you. What did Mrs. Smith say? She told me that if I married Eliza, she would forgive me. I could not do that, and I was sent from her house. The next day, I came to your house and left Marianne very unhappy. Oh, how awful I was. They were both silent for a few moments. I told myself that I did not care for her. I believed myself until I received her letters. Then I knew I cared for her more than any other woman in the world. Unfortunately, my marriage to Miss Grey was already decided. With my head and heart full of your sister, I had to play the happy lover to another woman. And on the evening we met, Marianne was calling to me. She was as beautiful as an angel. I left as soon as I could, but not before I saw Marianne's face, as white as death. That is the last time I saw her. But what about your letter to her? Ah, yes. What do you think of my wife's letter writing? Your wife? The letter was in your own hand. She told me what to write. She was there when I opened the letter. She knew I did not love her. I copied my wife's words and said goodbye to Marianne. Miss Dashwood, after hearing this, do you still hate me? No, but you have given my sister great sadness. Please tell your sister all of this, and tell her that she is dearer to me than ever. I will, but tell me, why have you come here tonight? Last night in town, I met Sir John Middleton. He told me that Marianne was dying, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop me from coming. Now you know all. Eleanor made no answer. She thought of how too much money and free time had changed this man, making him cold-hearted and selfish. How different he would have been without them. Well, he replied, goodbye. I hope I will not hear of your sister's marriage to another for a long time. If it should be the one man I dislike. With these words, he ran out of the room. Half an hour after Willoughby left the house, another carriage arrived. She ran to meet her mother. Mrs. Dashwood could not speak, but entered the house on Colonel Brandon's arm. In 2 minutes, she was with Marianne. She sat by her all night. Eleanor thought only of Willoughby, poor Willoughby, as she now called him. She did not know how she would tell her sister. Fortunately, with her mother by her side, Marianne grew better every day. Mrs. Dashwood, now looking very cheerful, felt like the happiest woman in the world. My Eleanor, Colonel Brandon loves Marianne. He has told me so himself. It would be a good thing for one of you to marry Colonel Brandon, and I believe Marianne will be the happiest with him. Eleanor did not know why she should think so, given the difference in their age and character. We talked in the carriage, and it seems he has loved her ever since he first saw her. Eleanor was sure these were her mother's thoughts. He loves her much more than Willoughby ever did. No, he is not as handsome as Willoughby, but his manners are more pleasing. She paused. At Delaford, she will be close to us, and we could even try to find a small cottage there. When Marianne was well again, she invited Colonel Brandon to thank him for taking care of her and her mother. His face, on entering the room and taking her hand, showed more than his feelings for Marianne. Indeed, he must have been thinking of his Eliza. Mrs. Dashwood decided they would return to Barton. The Dashwoods were on the road for 2 days in Colonel Brandon's large carriage. In the house, everywhere Marianne looked, she remembered Willoughby. After 2 or 3 days, Marianne, leaning on Eleanor's arm, went for a walk outside. They walked very slowly, and after a short time, Marianne said, "There," pointing with one hand, "is where I first saw Willoughby." Eleanor remembered her promise to Willoughby. She thought she should wait until her sister was stronger. My illness has made me think, and I have been selfish for too long. The strength of my feelings for Willoughby made this situation as unpleasant as it is. Whenever I look back, I only see the people I have disappointed. You, Mother, Mrs. Jennings, the Middletons, the Palmers, and the Steeles. I have behaved very badly, but if only I knew Willoughby's heart. At this point, Eleanor turned to her sister and told her everything Willoughby had said. Marianne said nothing, but became whiter than ever. Returning to the house, Marianne went upstairs. "Tell Mama," was all she said. Chapter 12. Love Takes Time. Mrs. Dashwood heard the story of Willoughby quietly. She was sorry for him, and she wished him well. In the evening, when the three of them were all together, Marianne spoke about him again. "I want to tell you both," she said, "that I wish for no change. I never could have been happy with him after knowing all this. It is true, sister, your marriage would have had so many problems, and you would have always been poor. He is so selfish that his needs would have always been first." "Selfish?" asked Marianne. "Yes, my happiness was not his main thought. He feels bad for what he has done," continued Eleanor, "as it has not made him happy. But would you have been happy if you had married him? I do not think so." Eleanor grew impatient for news of Edward. She had heard nothing of him since her leaving London. Soon enough, a servant came to her. "Did you hear," he said, "that Mr. Ferrars is married?" Marianne saw Eleanor turn pale and fell back in her chair. "Who told you that Mr. Ferrars was married, Thomas?" Mrs. Dashwood asked him. "I saw Mr. Ferrars myself, ma'am, this morning, and his lady too, Miss Steele. They were in a great hurry, but told me, when they come back, they'd make sure to come and see you. She said how she had changed her name." "Was Mr. Ferrars in the carriage with her?" "Yes, ma'am, but he did not look up." "Thank you, Thomas." Mrs. Dashwood and Eleanor were soon left by themselves. Mrs. Dashwood then knew that Eleanor had been strong for her sister, while secretly she had been thinking of Edward. She had not thought he would marry Lucy. Mrs. Dashwood felt terrible for thinking only of Marianne when poor Eleanor had been thinking of Edward all this time. Eleanor now knew the difference between the thought of an unpleasant event and its coming true. She saw that she had always hoped that something would happen to stop him from marrying Lucy. But now it was too late, and he was married. Eleanor thought a friend in London might write to tell her the news, but no news came. As she sat at the window, she saw a man riding a horse. He stopped at their gate. It was a gentleman. It was Colonel Brandon. No, it was not Colonel Brandon. It must be Edward. She looked again. It was Edward. Eleanor made herself sit down. She saw her mother and Marianne change color and whisper a few sentences to each other. They all waited in silence for their visitor. His face, as he entered the room, was not happy. Mrs. Dashwood gave him her hand and congratulated him on his marriage. He turned red and said something they could not understand. They sat down again and talked of the weather. After a long pause, Eleanor asked, "Is Mrs. Ferrars at Longstaple?" "No," he replied, surprised. "My mother is in town." "I meant," said Eleanor, "Mrs. Edward Ferrars." He looked confused. "Do you mean my brother?" "You mean Mrs. Robert Ferrars." "Mrs. Robert Ferrars?" repeated Marianne and her mother in amazement. He walked to the window, not knowing what to do. "Yes, my brother has married. He married Miss Lucy Steele." Eleanor could sit no longer. She ran out of the room, and as soon as the door was closed, burst into tears of happiness. Edward saw her leave and soon left the room himself. Mrs. Dashwood, Marianne, and Margaret were left very surprised. Edward had come to Barton to do one thing, and that was to ask Eleanor to marry him. When he returned to their house at 3 o'clock, he did just that, and they all sat down to eat at 4 o'clock in a very happy manner. His situation had changed from terrible sadness to great happiness very quickly. He could now be with the one he truly loved. His heart was now open to Eleanor, and he told her how his boyish feelings for Lucy had changed. "I believe myself to be in love, but now I know I was not." Mrs. Dashwood was delighted to have Edward as a son-in-law. Marianne could speak her happiness only by tears. Eleanor could not have been happier from the moment of learning of Lucy's marriage to Robert, after he asked for her hand. Edward stayed at the cottage for a week, for he and Eleanor had not been together for a long time. One of the first things they talked of was Lucy's marriage. Eleanor did not understand how Robert could have married her, as she knew he did not think much of her. Edward did not know and could not tell her how long it had been going on between them. The first he had heard of it was in a letter from Lucy herself, which he showed to Eleanor. "Dear Sir, as I am sure that you no longer love me, I have decided to give my love to another. I am now very happy with your brother, and we have just been married 1 week ago. I wish you every happiness and hope we can still be friends. I have burnt all your letters and will return your picture. Please destroy my letters, but the ring with my hair you may keep. Your sincere friend and sister, Lucy Ferrars." Eleanor read and returned it. "Well," she said, "they are married, and your mother has given Robert everything." "She will be betrayed by them and their secret wedding," replied Edward. "Still, your behavior was wrong, Edward, in visiting us when you were engaged to Lucy." "I know, but I thought that if I were engaged to another, there could be no danger in my being with you. I told myself that what we had was only a friendship, but I secretly knew it was much more." Edward heard with pleasure that Colonel Brandon would soon be visiting. He wanted to thank him again for giving him the job at Delaford. He became very interested in the place, and Eleanor was able to tell him all about it. There was one question left to answer. How were they to live? Edward had £200, and Eleanor £150. They were not quite enough in love to think that £350 a year would be enough. About 4 days after Edward's arrival, Colonel Brandon came. He had thought of little else but Marianne, and arrived at the cottage very pleased to see her looking so well. He and Edward had many conversations, and soon became good friends. A fortunate thing, when they were in love with two sisters. Colonel Brandon and Edward left Barton together. They went immediately to Delaford, so that Edward might know more about his future home. From there, Edward went to town to try to speak with his mother. This is what happened next. Mrs. Ferrars forgave her son and, after much talking on both sides, agreed to the marriage of Eleanor and Edward. However, all her money was now Robert's, and she could not promise them anything. They were not surprised. Eleanor and Edward were married in Barton Church, early in the autumn. They soon moved to Delaford, and Mrs. Jennings, when she visited them, never saw a happier couple. They had nothing to wish for but the marriage of Marianne and Colonel Brandon. They were soon visited by almost all their relations and friends. Mrs. Ferrars came to see them, as did the Dashwoods. Some time after Lucy and Robert married, they went to Mrs. Ferrars to ask for her forgiveness. It was given, and, after a time, they found a house in town, and Lucy became as important to Mrs. Ferrars as Robert or Fanny. Eleanor's marriage did not keep her from her family, as her mother and sisters spent much more than half their time with her. Her mother's only wish was to bring Marianne and Colonel Brandon together. Edward and Eleanor also wished to see their sister at Delaford. Knowing all of this and how good a man Colonel Brandon was, what could she do? She had once thought him too old, but at 19 her feelings changed, and they too were married. Colonel Brandon now felt he was the happiest man alive. Marianne could never love by halves, and she became, in time, as much in love with her husband as she had once been with Willoughby. Willoughby never forgot Marianne, and while his life was not terrible or sad, he always thought of Marianne and how they might have been. He decided that Marianne was the most beautiful woman in the world, and would always be so. Mrs. Dashwood stayed at the cottage with her youngest daughter, and between Barton and Delaford, they were always traveling. At Delaford, the sisters Eleanor and Marianne lived long, happy lives with their husbands. Playlet, Sense and Sensibility. All are seated around a beautifully set breakfast table, having just finished eating. There is excited chatter as the group considers the fun excursion planned to Whitwell. A maid enters with the letters. Colonel Brandon receives his letter, looks at it, changes color, and immediately leaves the room.
What is the matter with Brandon?
I hope he has had no bad news. It must be something extraordinary that could make Colonel Brandon leave my breakfast table so suddenly.
Oh, yes, it is very strange indeed.
What kind of news do you think it might be, Eleanor? I don't know.
Colonel Brandon re-enters, looking concerned.
No bad news, Colonel, I hope.
None at all, ma'am. I thank you.
Was it from Avignon? I hope it is not to say that your sister is worse.
No, ma'am. It came from town and is just a letter of business.
But how could a business letter make you look so concerned, Colonel? Come, and tell us the truth.
My dear madam, please be careful of what you are saying. I am sure the Colonel has a reason for not telling us.
Perhaps it is to tell you that your cousin Fanny is married?
No, indeed it is not.
Well then, I know who it is from, Colonel, and I hope she is well.
Whom do you mean, ma'am?
Oh, you know who I mean.
I'm very sorry, ma'am, to receive this letter today, as it is on urgent business. I must go to town immediately. To town? Today? I am all the more sorry, as it is necessary for me to be there, for you all to enter Whitwell today. I am afraid we must go to Whitwell some other time.
But if you write a note to the housekeeper, Mr. Brandon, would that be enough?
No, I'm afraid not. We must go. We won't delay when we are so near it. You cannot go to town till tomorrow, Brandon, that is all. I wish it were that easy, but I must go at once.
Perhaps if you could just tell us what your business is, we could decide whether or not it is so important.
Couldn't you just be 6 hours late and wait until we return this afternoon?
No, I cannot lose 1 hour.
Some people can't stand to have fun. Brandon is one of them. I'm sure he was afraid of catching a cold and wrote the letter himself as a way of getting out of going.
Oh, yes, I am sure you are right.
Well, I know I can't change your mind, Brandon, but I hope you will think better of it. The 3 Miss Dashwoods have come up from the cottage, and Mr. Willoughby got up 2 hours before his usual time, just to go to Whitwell. I truly am sorry to ruin your morning, but I must go.
Oh, what a shame.
Well, then when will you come back again? If you are not here by the end of the week, I will go after you.
Yes, do, Sir John. And then perhaps you will find out what his business is.
I do not want to do that. It might be something he is ashamed of.
A male servant enters.
Sir, your horses are ready.
Colonel Brandon begins to say his goodbyes.
Is there no chance of my seeing you and your sisters in town this winter, Miss Dashwood?
I am afraid none at all. We will stay with our mother this winter.
Then I will not see you for a long time, which is a very sad thing.
Really? This is very strange.
Yes, just like the Colonel to ruin a fun day out.
But listen, I know what his business is.
Do you, ma'am?
Yes, it is about Miss Williams, I am sure.
And who is Miss Williams?
What? Don't you know who Miss Williams is?
You must have heard of her before. She is a relation of the Colonel's, my dear. A very near relation.
My dear, she is his daughter.